Patrick and I are going to present a few points regarding the book, but I want to start by asking why agribusiness, why now, and what are some of the real challenges and opportunities facing Africa. Candy's talked about this. If you look at recent patterns of economic growth in Africa, they've been driven by the commodity boom. They've been characterized by some deindustrialization that followed structural adjustment. Some of that may be warranted deindustrialization because it wasn't competitive. But you've had agricultural growth largely through extensification. And you compare that pattern with patterns of growth in Asia, and you end up asking, is this really sustainable? Is this going to give the future that Candy's talking about? Part of the response of the African community has been the CADP, the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Program, which really focuses on what I'm calling the big A agriculture, big A in the sense of looking at this as a whole value chain rather than just farming. And partly that reflects the declining importance of farming in GDP. You see the decline there from 42% of GDP in 65 to 12% recently. Partly that reflects the mining and petroleum boom, but partly it also reflects some transformation. And if you think about the agriculture as the motor of growth argument that's often made, it really depends on linkages, including forward and backward linkages, not just consumption linkages. And that's only possible if you have integration within sectors of the economy. So one way of thinking about structural transformation is not just a reduction in the relative contribution of farming in the economy, but rather an integration of where value added takes place in the agri-food system. So whereas in a lot of African countries, 65% of the value added in food really is created on the farm, if you look at a place like the US, it's under 10%. So you often hear these statements that one US farmer can feed 70-some people. That's a lie. It's the one farmer and the two truckers and the kid at McDonald's and the fertilizer producer and so on, and the farm family itself can't even feed itself by itself. It's this integration that's inherent in structural transformation. So even as farming gets transformed, so does agro-industry. Those are indissociable. Other reasons for why I focus on agribusiness, one is the time bomb of employment that Candy talked about. This is the big issue of generating jobs for the large number of youth who are coming onto the job market, some with relatively poor skills, but all of whom, or most of whom, have cell phones. Agribusiness also can make some important contributions to the various Millennium Development Goals. The number one goal on hunger and poverty alleviation, largely not just through food production, but employment creation and wealth creation that way. But also in terms of dealing with what Timmer, Falcon, and Pearson called the food price dilemma, namely that you want remunerative prices for farmers and people in the food system, but consumers need low prices. One way of dealing with that is through market segmentation, which allows profitability to increase, but you need transformation, industrial transformation of food to deal with the segmentation. Agribusiness also contributes to the MDG on women's empowerment. As we'll see, women are heavily involved in various types of agribusiness and in developing global partnerships, the type of things that Candy was talking about. It's also where much of Africa is starting in terms of its industrial capacity. This graph just shows by country the percent of value added that comes from agribusiness, and as you can see in places like Senegal, you're talking over 50% of value added. But this involvement, or the structure of agribusiness and agri-processing is highly heterogeneous. If you look at the World Development Report 2008 that Derek co-edited, it makes a very important point that smallholder farming is highly heterogeneous in Africa. You've got some people on the lower end with very few resources that really can't farm their way out of poverty. And then you've got other groups that have more growth potential, and one of the questions is, what's going to be the employment source for those smallest of the small? Well, you see a very similar kind of thing in agri-processing. This is a table put together by some colleagues in West Africa who try to classify agri-processing between really the micro and the large. And what's striking is that the smallest and sort of the medium enterprise kinds of things account for the bulk of the number of firms, not necessarily the bulk of the output. But as we think about a strategy, the strategy is going to be quite different depending on where you focus. Another reason why now is the demand internationally is growing for processed goods. Particularly in emerging economies, this is where the most rapid growth is for processed products. In Africa, very large growth not only internationally but regionally and nationally. And national and regional markets often receive less attention in a lot of the literature on agribusiness. There's a lot of focus on shipping green beans to France and so on, but just as IFPRI has shown that the largest growth for agricultural commodities tends to be locally and regionally, the same thing tends to be true for processed products. These are just some projections that the NAPAD Secretariat did in terms of where growth is likely to occur for food and in Africa. And what you see is the dominance of the growth for food markets in urban areas. And as people move to urban areas and the opportunity cost of time increases for women and so on, the demand for marketing services also goes up. So increased demand for processing and so on. This is work that should look familiar to IFPRI because it came from IFPRI, looking at markets in West Africa or in Africa, and what is striking here is that the domestic markets for food staples are by far the largest growth area. Relatively underexploited are the regional markets, and as I'll argue, this is one of the areas where markets for agribusiness really are large. So that's kind of a why agribusiness, why now? One is that there is a global opportunity here. There's been a big shift over the last 30 years in the locus of agri-processing in the world, much from the shift from the OECD countries to an increasing share in developing countries. To date, that's been largely in Asia, but there's some potential shifts that could move into Africa as particularly prices of water go up. I was in some discussions a couple of years ago, and there was a large U.S. Tomato processing company that was looking in Africa for places where it might be able to source tomato paste because they were concerned about rising costs of water in the Central Valley of California. Pumping costs for water going up in China and a lot of other places, so there's some potential there if the business environment is favorable. And there have been some important improvements in terms of macroeconomic reforms and political stability, and some real moves from going from just rhetoric towards regional integration in a few areas, such as the integration of the West African power pool, which is going to be really important in terms of ensuring electricity sustainability for agro-industry. So this just illustrates the point I wanted to make about recent shifts in the locus of manufacturing value added over time, and what it shows is this rapid growth in the developing world for processing capacity, reflecting both demands in those areas and export opportunities from those areas to industrialized countries. Let me just touch on a few of the challenges and opportunities facing the development of a strategy such as is put out in the book. The first one is sort of obvious but often forgotten, and that is that agro-industrialization has to be based on comparative advantage. If you simply process goods, that's not necessarily value added. If you do it in an inefficient way and lose money, that's value subtraction. And a lot of Africa is littered with a lot of what I call value subtraction projects that tried to process goods for which there was not a comparative advantage. One of the challenges is, where do you focus? You saw that diversity in the firms. Are you going to focus on the smallest of the small, the largest of the large, or somewhere in between? The strategies are very different depending on the relative area of focus. And the success really depends critically on issues outside of the agricultural sector, in particular on electrical supply. If you think about running a processing firm, and I think UNIDO's done some studies in Nigeria that illustrate this well. You get your line running and all of a sudden power is cut. You've got to throw out everything on the line, or you've got to invest in your own electrical generator that's going to double your cost of power. So without more reliable electrical supply, it's very hard to be competitive. Same thing goes with reliable transport. Both those things typically involve some public investment as well as private. ICT, of course, plays a critical role, and increasingly mobile apps for doing things like traceability and so on are moving along. There, the ICT revolution has been driven largely by private investment, but public policy regarding licensing and competitiveness can make a huge difference in the cost of cell service. If you compare someplace like Rwanda with Ethiopia, for example, it's really quite striking. There's a whole set of things about the ease of doing business and contract enforcement. I've been doing some work in Mali, and one of the problems processors have there is contract enforcement with farmer groups when they violate conditions in terms of quality. Farmer groups are basically politically protected, and so what you're finding are processors now vertically integrating back into farming in a highly mechanized way that doesn't generate much employment, just to overcome the contract enforcement problem. There are issues of land tenure and the rules for foreign investment in land. The need to create a social space for multi-actor groups, what are called in the French interprofessions. Value chain participant councils are discussed in the group, and other kinds of professional organizations that allow broader private voice. And then really going further to making regional integration really real. The ECOWAS Treaty in West Africa talks about free movement of people and goods, but if you try to move a truck from one place to another, you find out it's not really free. So how do you deal with that? A couple of other points. As a university person, you knew I'd have to say something about human capital. But what we see is a big mismatch between potential job skills needed and those that are being generated by educational systems in a lot of African places. This is not only at the university level, but a big missing gap on vocational education. And a need to focus on more than just agronomy and plant science and so on. Things like food sciencing, packaging, logistics are big missing gaps. And the managerial skills, as I've mentioned, are going to vary by the type of firm and so on. Finally, there's a gap in a lot of countries in terms of the policy analysis skills in government. If you really want to push public-private partnerships, you need people in government who understand private business and in a global economy. There are also a number of issues related to financing that the book deals with. Because there's some real limits in terms of both traditional bank financing and the ability of a lot of commercial banks in Africa to really judge risks related to agriculture and agribusiness, and limits in microcredit, because the real growth potential is probably away from the smallest of the small firms, so you're going to need volumes of credit that probably are larger than microcredit can provide. given the time, maybe I'll skip over this, but the main point of this graph is to show that as you move away from selling just under-differentiated commodities, which would be on your left, towards consumer-ready products, the sources of comparative advantage shift away from just natural endowment of factors towards the human capital-driven things. So it really emphasizes the need to invest in those. There are a number of other countries that have had successes, and there's the capacity to learn from these. The World Bank's Awakening Africa's Sleeping Giant report talks a lot about these. The importance of policy reforms, market orientation and in alignment with comparative advantage, and this is particularly true in terms of choice of technique in processing and in farming, that in countries where labor is abundant relative to capital, big mechanized operations aren't necessarily the best way to modernize. Big doesn't necessarily equal modern. The use of trade negotiations and agreements, both to get into OECD countries, but also for regional trade within Africa. Investment in ag industrial research and extension services. I think Brazil's the really classic example here, where Embrapa played just an enormously important role in increasing agricultural productivity through research. And the challenges is as you move towards social inclusion. In some sense, a value chain wants to be exclusive in the sense that you want to exclude bad quality, but how do you do that without excluding the bulk of the poor? There are a number of contentious issues that always come up in here, and here are just a few of them. The role of GMOs in these strategies, the issue of farm size, how climate change falls into all of this, the development of biofuels. Are you putting fuel tanks in competition with people's stomachs, or is this an area that has a lot of potential? The balance between regional integration and national interests. There are a lot of regional trade agreements out there in Africa, and where they hit the rocks happens to be when there's conflicts in national interest. We've seen that with the high price spikes recently, where a number of countries like Mali, Burkina have put on trade bans in contravention to free trade agreements to try to hold food within the country. And then the whole issue of land tenure, and what goes by land grabs. Those are all contentious issues, and so I'll let Patrick deal with all of those. And he can talk about how the book and UNIDO has developed pillars to deal with that. So, Patrick.